Hello, Booktube. Today is the third day of LitMas, which is turning out to be a very interesting project created by Adrian at Stripped Cover Lit. And I'm really enjoying it, and I'm a little challenged by it, which is fun. And today is short stories. It's a cold, cold day here in New England. We've got to go out this evening for a game night with some friends, but yeah, getting dark early, obviously, and it's a bit chilly out there. So we've been lazy, hanging around inside the house for most of the day, and my wife and daughter have been baking Christmas cookies, so there's a nice smell in the house. So short stories. My own particular background with short stories began when I was a young man with the science fiction magazines. And I used to have shelves and shelves and shelves of them. And I wish I still did, because I also love some of the cover art. And I used to get Galaxy, Analog, Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. I still remember the covers. Some of the classic covers, they're just wonderful. And the writers, Poole Anderson, Asimov, Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke. So that's going to be how I come to this. The types of short stories I like. I mean, I like literary. I'm not a big fan of the term literary fiction. I mean, if it's literature, it's literature. You know. But what are considered classic short stories, I like some of those. And obviously I like Hemingway, but for me it's science fiction and fantasy are the short stories I like. I think of great ones like Clarke's The 9 Billion Names of God, or I think it was Heinlein's Roads Must Roll. There's just all sorts of stories that come to mind. Is it The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury? Yeah. So I found a few sitting in the house. I don't have what I used to have. One was in this famous science fiction stories. 35 great stories of the world's of atomic power, rockets, robots, time and space machines, etc., edited by Raymond J. Healy and J. Francis McComas, and this is a modern library giant. And this was published first in 1946 and then 1957 is the one I have here. So the first modern library giant edition is 57, this. So it must have come out as a different version. And the story that was one of my favorites that's in here is Nightfall by Isaac Asimov. Let me show you that. And this is a little blurb they have to explain this story. Taking advantage of the wonderfully broad latitude science fiction allows its authors, Mr. Asimov has conceived of a planet where the sun shines day and night and darkness falls but once in a millennium. In a startling reversal of Emerson's hypothesis, Asimov conceives the week of darkness as a period of terror and chaos. The result is a penetrating study in mass psychology, a haunting picture of a race doomed by fear of the dark to ever-recurring ruin and destruction. And he says a reversal of Emerson's hypothesis. And here's the quote that leads off the story itself, and it is Emerson. If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God? By Emerson. Asimov turns this on its head. What if once in 1,000 years it got dark for the first time so you could see the stars? It would be mind-blowing. And some parts of the story seem a bit dated because it's an older story. But the point is still there. The impact of the story still works. So I won't read it to you, but it's one I would recommend for any science fiction fan, Nightfall. But then I got to thinking how much has changed in the world since I would read these stories regularly. I still read them occasionally, but regularly. And when I was a young boy, nuclear threat was felt to be very real. It's still real. And that's why I was thinking about it with all that's going on in the news now. We had a more fine-tuned sense of just how devastating and serious nuclear weapons were. It permeated every part of culture. It wasn't like, well, tell the other guy he's a little fella and we could whoop him with our nuclear weapons. Would have not been thought of as it would have been thought of as reckless. So I was thinking, what sort of short story illustrated a world that I grew up in where you had mad, mutual assured destruction and the horrors of what we always called the nuclear winter. And there was a story that stood out to me about the nuclear winter and just how devastating it would be. And that is found in the 1986 annual World's Best FF, edited by Donald A. Walheim. That illustration's for a story that's also near Robert Silverberg's Sailing to Byzantium, which is a wonderful story, but that's not the one I'm going to talk about. So, this was Daw Books, which is Donald A. Walheim, New York, and it's from 1986. I'll give you a list of some of the titles in here. Earthgate by J. Brian Clark. On the Dream Channel Panel by Ian Watson. The Gods of Mars, which was by Gardner Dozois, Jack Dan, and Michael Swanwick. The Jaguar Hunter, Lucius Shepard. Sailing to Byzantium, was Robert Silverberg. Web Rider by J.G. Carr. With Virgil Odom at the East Pole by Harlan Ellison. The Curse of Kings by Connie Willis. And Pots by C.J. Shira. But the one I wanted to talk about is Fermi and Frost by Frederick Pohl. And it first appeared in Asimov's science fiction magazine in 1985. And I'll show it to you here. And Frederick Pohl was one of the big names in science fiction at the time. And here's a little intro piece by the editor to the story. Frederick Pohl has become something of a world traveler, and a visit to the strange volcanic land of Iceland must have inspired this vision of nuclear disaster. This is not so much a story of imaginative projection as an attempt to depict accurately, without self-delusion, what may well happen. And it's the main character is he's a scientist that's in charge of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, at one of the big telescopes. And his name is Harry Malibert, and he's at an airport when the bombs start going. And a little boy, Timmy, who's not his son, ends up with him through the chaos and disasters, and he takes care of them. And they get to Iceland, and it shows the struggle for survival with a nuclear winter, and the devastation to the planet is unbelievable. But it's done as accurately as the science of the time would allow, taking into account not only radiation clouds, the darkening of the atmosphere, the devastation of the natural world on all fronts, and then the freeze, and it just, how do you survive, and could you? And that's a very serious question, because odds are that the entire race is wiped out. So it's a very stark story that allows you to really get a handle on just what a nuclear conflict would look like or could look like. And it has two characters, a middle-aged man and a young boy trying to survive. So Fermi and Frost by Frederick Pohl is sort of indicative of the types of stories, short stories, that I've always enjoyed. So heavily influenced by my reading growing up in the science fiction and fantasy magazines. And thank you, Booktube.